Most people fear modern tech monopolies, but imagine a corporation that didn't just sell your data. Imagine a corporation with a private standing army of 260,000 men, a board of directors that ordered sovereign assassinations. This is the raw anatomy of the British East India Company. History books teach you that the British Empire conquered India. That is a fundamental geopolitical lie. India was not conquered by a sovereign government. It was completely subjugated by a private corporation operating out of a tiny, dark office in London, the ultimate unrestricted corporate cartel. The year 1600, London. A group of wealthy merchants pooled their capital to buy a monopoly on trade in the East. They were not warriors, they were accountants, but they quickly realized that free trade is a geopolitical myth. Therefore, they armed their merchant ships with heavy military cannons. The early objective was mathematically simple. Buy spices cheaply in Asia, sell them at a premium in Europe. But the established cartels of the time, the Dutch and the Portuguese, fiercely protected their profit margins with naval violence. Therefore, the company had to transition from logistics to militarized logistics. You cannot negotiate trade deals when your competitors are aggressively sinking your fleet. But funding a private navy is mathematically unsustainable for a mere trading company. Therefore, the company demanded and received unprecedented sovereign powers from the English crown, the absolute right to wage private war. This was the geopolitical Rubicon. A private entity driven entirely by shareholder dividends was officially granted the legal authority of a nation-state. They could mint their own currency, build fortresses, and execute foreign diplomats. The state had completely outsourced its foreign policy to the cartel. They arrived in India. At the time, the Mughal Empire was an economic leviathan, controlling a quarter of the world's wealth. The British merchants were insignificant beggars at the emperor's court, but the cartel plays the long game. Therefore, they bowed, paid taxes, and quietly built their coastal factories. For a century, they operated submissively within the Mughal system. But by the early 1700s, the massive Mughal operating system began to critically fragment, internal rebellions, bankruptcies. Therefore, the cartel recognized a catastrophic geopolitical vacuum forming across the entire subcontinent. When a state fails, security is instantly privatized. The regional Indian governors, the Nawabs, desperately needed military support to survive. But the rival French East India Company was already arming opposing factions. Therefore, the British cartel had to enter the mercenary business to protect its supply chains. They didn't just hire local soldiers, they engineered a highly disciplined, European-style corporate army, the sepoys. This was asymmetric warfare, a small, technologically superior force that could completely dismantle a massive, undisciplined traditional army. The cartel was actively testing its new lethal software. 1756, Bengal, the richest province in India. The young Nawab, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, realized the cartel was building an illegal militarized fortress in Calcutta. He legally demanded they stop, but the cartel arrogantly ignored the sovereign leader. Therefore, the Nawab attacked and captured the corporate outpost. This was an unacceptable disruption to shareholder value. The cartel's response was not diplomatic. They sent Robert Clive, an accountant turned ruthless military commander. But Clive knew that a direct, honorable military assault was mathematically risky. Therefore, he utilized the classic Medici playbook, total subversion. June 1757, the Battle of Plassey. History selectively records it as a great British military victory. That is a manufactured PR narrative. It was not a battle, it was a hostile corporate buyout. Clive didn't defeat the Nawab's army, he simply bought the Nawab's supreme commander. Mir Jafar, the commander of the Bengali forces, was secretly promised the throne in exchange for his absolute betrayal. When the battle began, the massive Indian army simply stood perfectly still. The cartel won the richest province in the world, practically without firing a shot. This is the cold reality of realpolitik. Loyalty is always for sale if you control the ledgers. The cartel didn't conquer Bengal with muskets and artillery. They conquered it with debt, bribery, and severe psychological manipulation. The accountant had successfully hijacked the kingdom. Mir Jafar was installed as a puppet ruler, but he quickly realized he wasn't a king, he was a heavily indebted middleman. The cartel aggressively emptied the Bengali treasury, transferring millions of pounds directly into the private accounts of the board of directors in London. The sheer scale of the wealth extraction was unprecedented in human history. It literally fueled the beginning of the British Industrial Revolution. But stripping the capital from a sovereign state has immediate catastrophic biological consequences for the native population. 1770, the Great Bengal Famine. 10 million people starved to death. 1/3 of the population was physically eradicated. But the cartel's primary directive is profit, not human life. Therefore, while millions starved, the company actually aggressively increased its tax collection rates to maintain dividends. They forced the starving farmers to plant cash crops like indigo instead of food. They hoarded grain to sell at inflated prices. This was not a natural disaster. It was a mathematically engineered corporate genocide, driven entirely by the demand for quarterly shareholder returns. A private company had become a rogue, hyper-lethal sovereign state. They had completely monopolized the violence and the economy of a subcontinent. But the cartel soon faced a massive logistical problem. They were buying massive amounts of tea from China, and they were running out of silver to pay for it. Next, the narco-state. By the late 18th century, the British Empire was absolutely addicted to Chinese tea, millions of pounds of it. But the Qing dynasty in China operated a closed, self-sufficient economic fortress. They demanded payment exclusively in silver. Therefore, the cartel was rapidly bleeding its capital reserves. A massive trade deficit is a geopolitical death sentence. The cartel desperately needed a product that China would be forced to buy. But China produced everything it needed internally. Therefore, the company had to artificially manufacture a massive, unbreakable consumer demand. They chose narcotics. They looked at their newly conquered territory of Bengal. They realized they controlled the perfect agricultural climate for a highly addictive cash crop, opium. the cartel transitioned from a spice trading company into the largest, most militarized drug syndicate in human history. Growing opium is an agricultural process, but weaponizing it on a global scale is pure geopolitics. Therefore, the East India Company established a ruthless corporate monopoly on poppy cultivation. They forced Bengali farmers to grow poison instead of food, locking them into perpetual debt. The production was industrialized, but it was strictly illegal to sell opium inside the Qing Empire. Therefore, the cartel created a massive, highly sophisticated shadow logistics network. They auctioned the opium in Calcutta to private independent smugglers known as country ships. The company never sailed the opium directly into China. This provided them with absolute plausible deniability, the ultimate corporate legal shield. The smugglers took the risk, bribed the Chinese port officials in Canton, and flooded the subterranean market with the narcotic. The strategy was a devastating mathematical success. Millions of chests flowed into China. Silver flowed out. The massive trade deficit was violently reversed. But the biological impact on the Qing Empire was catastrophic. The cartel had successfully hacked the neurology of an entire civilization. Millions became hopelessly addicted. The Qing military and bureaucracy were functionally paralyzed by the narcotic. The empire was physically collapsing from the inside. But the Qing emperor finally realized his nation was being systematically dismantled. Therefore, he appointed Lin Zexu, an incorruptible official, to stop the cartel. 1839. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton. He did not negotiate. He immediately blockaded the foreign factories and demanded the surrender of all illicit inventory. He didn't just seize the opium, he publicly destroyed 20,000 chests of corporate property by dissolving it in trenches of lime and salt. Destroying narcotics is a moral victory for a sovereign state, but destroying corporate assets is considered an act of war by a cartel. Therefore, the powerful company lobbyists in London immediately demanded absolute military retaliation from the British government. Parliament debated the morality of a war for drugs, but the entire British economy was now fundamentally addicted to the tea tax revenue, which was purchased exclusively with opium silver. Therefore, morality predictably surrendered to logistics. The state deployed its military to protect the cartel's profit margins. 1840, the First Opium War. It wasn't a war, it was a technological slaughter. The Qing dynasty deployed traditional wooden junks and ancient coastal cannons, but the British arrived with steam-powered ironclads firing explosive, highly destructive shells. The technological asymmetry was absolute. The oldest continuous civilization on Earth was mathematically dismantled in a matter of months by a corporation's enforcement wing. The Qing military was utterly incapable of defending its sovereign borders against industrialized corporate violence. The cartel had forced the fortress open. 1842, the Treaty of Nanking, the first of the unequal treaties. China was legally forced to pay massive silver reparations to the cartel for the very opium they had destroyed. They were forced to open 5 ports to unrestricted foreign trade, completely surrendering their economic sovereignty. But The ultimate geopolitical prize was not just open ports. The cartel demanded a permanent sovereign launch pad. Therefore, they annexed an obscure, barren, rocky island off the coast, Hong Kong. It became the ultimate corporate fortress for British financial dominance in Asia. The East India Company had successfully transformed international drug trafficking into standard, legally protected free trade. They had used the full military weight of the British Empire to force a superpower to consume poison at gunpoint. This is the zenith of the corporate Leviathan. No government, no monarch, no parliament possessed the operational ruthlessness of the East India Company. They operated beyond the boundaries of human morality, driven exclusively by the cold mathematical logic of the ledger. They owned continents, they owned armies, but the laws of geopolitics state that infinite expansion is mathematically impossible. A system built entirely on extraction, violence, and debt eventually reaches a critical mass. The cartel was arrogant. They believed their algorithm of control was flawless. They were extracting wealth from India at an apocalyptic rate. They were treating their massive private army of sepoys not as human beings, but as disposable corporate assets. Therefore, a massive, catastrophic internal systemic failure was brewing in the heart of their Indian empire. The corporate operating system was about to crash. The greatest monopoly in history was about to face the one thing a ledger cannot predict: the absolute explosive rage of a colonized people. Next, the mutiny. By 1857, the East India Company commanded a private military of over 260,000 men, a corporate security force twice the size of the official British sovereign army. But an army of that colossal scale requires absolute mathematical discipline. Therefore, the cartel managed its soldiers exactly like its ledgers. They optimized every single variable for maximum profit. They viewed the complex cultural and religious software of the Indian subcontinent as mere logistical inefficiencies. But human belief systems cannot be erased by corporate mandates. Therefore, a massive, invisible psychological pressure cooker was rapidly building beneath the cartel's architecture. The corporate directors in London lived in an echo chamber of their own financial success. They assumed absolute control was a permanent state of nature. But geopolitics is dictated by the variables you ignore. Therefore, the catalyst for the greatest corporate collapse in history wasn't a rival army, it was a cartridge. The cartel introduced the new Enfield rifle to its sepoy mercenaries, a technological upgrade to increase killing efficiency. To load the weapon, soldiers had to bite open a greased paper cartridge, but a terrifying rumor spread through the ranks that the grease was made of cow and pig fat. For Hindu and Muslim soldiers, consuming this grease wasn't a minor offense. It was absolute spiritual contamination. It was biological and religious desecration. But the cartel's management fundamentally lacked the cultural empathy to understand this red line. Therefore, they treated the religious panic as a simple breach of corporate discipline.
When the soldiers legally refused to touch the cartridges, the company didn't negotiate. They sentenced the mutineers to 10 years of hard labor, publicly stripping them of their uniforms in front of their comrades. This was meant to be a display of absolute deterrence, but it achieved the exact opposite. It was the ultimate systemic failure of the deterrence model. When you push a population past the point of spiritual survival, fear completely evaporates. Therefore, on May 10, 1857, the corporate operating system violently crashed. The sepoys in Meerut turned their cartel-issued weapons directly against their cartel managers. This wasn't a localized riot, it was a massive decentralized military uprising. The sepoys marched to Delhi and declared the restoration of the Mughal emperor. The cartel had spent a century dismantling the old sovereign state, but in a matter of days, the ghost of the empire resurrected to destroy them. The East India Company completely lost control of the subcontinent. Their communication lines were severed, their logistics network was instantly paralyzed. Corporate executives who viewed themselves as invincible apex predators were suddenly hunted through the streets. The balance sheet had literally caught fire. The rebellion exposed the fundamental fragility of the corporate Leviathan. A cartel can buy loyalty, but it cannot buy faith. But the cartel still possessed massive capital reserves and the backing of the British Crown. Therefore, their retaliation was not about restoring order, it was about liquidating broken assets.
The company mobilized reinforcements and launched a counteroffensive of unprecedented brutality. They didn't treat the sepoys as enemy combatants, they treated them as defective corporate property. To break the psychological momentum of the rebellion, they resurrected the most terrifying forms of asymmetric deterrence. They utilized a method called blowing from a gun. Mutineers were physically tied to the mouths of heavy cannons, which were then fired. It was not just an execution, it was a calculated theatrical broadcast of absolute biological annihilation, designed to permanently hack the neurology of the survivors. Just like Vlad the Impaler's forest of stakes, the cartel engineered a landscape of extreme psychological horror to re-establish compliance. Entire villages suspected of harboring rebels were systematically burned to ash. The ledger was being balanced with an ocean of blood. The corporate mask had completely fallen off. By 1858, the cartel technically won the war. They mathematically crushed the rebellion. But the sheer scale of the atrocity horrified even the imperial politicians back in London. The PR disaster was absolute. Therefore, the British Parliament realized that a private corporation could no longer be trusted with a sovereign empire. The corporate operating system was deemed too unstable, too dangerous, and too legally compromising for the crown. The state decided to execute a hostile takeover of the cartel itself. In August 1858, the Government of India Act was passed, the ultimate corporate liquidation. The East India Company, the most powerful multinational corporation in human history, was officially nationalized. Its massive army, its territories, and its infinite debt were directly absorbed by the British state. The cartel was dead. But the extraction of wealth did not stop. It merely changed its legal framework. The British Raj was born. The Crown replaced the board of directors. The Queen became the Empress. The brutal, profit-driven algorithms of the company were seamlessly integrated into the bureaucratic machinery of the British Empire. The hardware was updated. The software of control remained identical. The East India Company proved a terrifying geopolitical theorem. It proved that a private entity, driven solely by the legal obligation to maximize shareholder value, can successfully conquer, drug, and dismantle entire civilizations. It proved that extreme capitalism without sovereign boundaries inevitably becomes a rogue state. We look back at the company as a historical anomaly, a relic of the colonial past. But look at the architectural structure of modern multinational tech monopolies and defense contractors. They operate across borders. They hold massive capital. They actively manipulate sovereign political systems to protect their data and profit. The East India Company didn't disappear. Its genetic code was simply open-sourced to the modern corporate world. The cartel learned that you no longer need a private army to conquer a nation. Next, you just need to control their infrastructure.
The post-World War II era. The physical empires were utterly bankrupt. The age of sending redcoats across the ocean to conquer a continent was mathematically and politically over. But the demand for global resource extraction had only multiplied. Therefore, the cartel had to undergo a radical, invisible evolution. They realized that physical military occupation is a logistical nightmare. It breeds costly, endless rebellions. But if you can conquer a sovereign nation financially, the citizens will literally pay for their own subjugation. Therefore, the corporate mercenary was seamlessly replaced by the international central banker. Welcome to the era of neo-colonialism. The weapon of choice is no longer the musket, the ironclad, or the opium chest. It is the infrastructure loan. The cartel meticulously targets a developing, resource-rich nation that desperately needs modernization to survive. They approach the sovereign leader with a glittering, irresistible proposal. Massive hydroelectric dams, deep-water ports, high-speed highways. They offer billions in international development loans. But there is always a brutal mathematical catch hidden deep within the legal contracts. The billions of dollars never actually enter the developing nation's local economy. Therefore, the capital is directly transferred from the international banks straight into the private accounts of the cartel's own mega engineering and construction firms back in the West. The cartel builds the massive infrastructure and takes the immediate, guaranteed profit. But the sovereign nation is left holding a colossal, compounding, dollar-denominated debt. A financial burden they are mathematically designed to fail to repay. The infrastructure projects are deliberately over-engineered and wildly overpriced. They are specifically designed to trigger a sovereign default. When the nation inevitably misses a critical payment, the geopolitical trap violently snaps shut. But the cartel no longer sends the Royal Navy to collect. Therefore, they send the economic auditors, the men in tailored suits. They fly into the capital city, sit in the presidential palace, and dictate the absolute terms of structural adjustment. They are the high priests of the modern financial inquisition. They demand the absolute privatization of state assets to balance the ledger, the national water supply, the electrical grid, the mineral rights.
the sovereign nation is legally forced to sell its vital biological organs to foreign holding companies at pennies on the dollar. This is the exact same wealth extraction model the East India Company used in Bengal, but it is completely sanitized. It is executed under the pristine, unassailable banner of global development and international economic aid, the perfect geopolitical camouflage.
Therefore, the local population rarely realizes they have been formally conquered. They don't see foreign soldiers patrolling their streets. They only see their taxes rising, their natural resources vanishing, and their public services being auctioned off to invisible multinational cartels. If a sovereign leader realizes the debt trap and completely refuses to comply, they are quickly labeled a radical dictator by the cartel's synchronized global media apparatus. But character assassination is just the opening salvo. Therefore, the cartel quietly funds the political opposition. They engineer artificial economic strikes, and if absolutely necessary, they authorize a covert regime change, replacing the uncooperative leader with a compliant corporate puppet, just like installing Mir Jafar at the Battle of Plassey. The architecture of sovereign debt is the most perfect system of control ever devised by human beings. It is invisible, self-sustaining, and legally completely bulletproof. But the cartel's appetite for control is infinite. Therefore, in the 21st century, they evolved yet again. They realized that controlling physical infrastructure, ports, highways, and water grids is no longer the ultimate geopolitical high ground. The new high ground is entirely digital. The cartel transitioned into massive tech monopolies. They built the invisible, ubiquitous architecture of the Internet, the fiber optic nervous system of the modern world. They became the architects of a new digital Bengal. They enthusiastically offer you free global communication, free social networks, free search engines. But in the brutal history of geopolitics, absolutely nothing is ever free. Therefore, the hidden price of admission is the total surrender of your psychological and behavioral data. The East India Company harvested physical opium to hack the neurology of the Qing Empire. The modern tech cartel harvests your digital data to hack the neurology of the entire global population. They build behavioral profiles so precise they can mathematically predict and manipulate sovereign elections. You are no longer just a physical citizen of a sovereign nation-state. You have been downgraded. You are now a biological data point residing permanently on a corporate server. The Leviathan of the state is being aggressively consumed by the Leviathan of the algorithm. We have systematically built a world where massive, unelected, transnational cartels possess more capital, more intelligence, and more operational power than any government on Earth. The hostile takeover of the human race is almost complete. Next, the final equation.
The East India Company proved that a cartel could mathematically hack a civilization by flooding it with physical narcotics. They used wooden ships and iron cannons to deliver opium. However, physical logistics are incredibly expensive and prone to disruption. To bypass these biological and geographic barriers, the modern tech cartel executed a genius evolutionary leap. They went straight for the neurology. Welcome
to the dopamine ledger. The cartel didn't invent addiction, they industrialized it on a cellular level. Your glowing screen is not a communication device. It is a behavioral modification syringe where every notification and algorithmically curated outrage acts as a calculated microdose of dopamine. Software engineers explicitly modeled these interfaces after Las Vegas slot machines, utilizing variable ratio schedules of reinforcement. While a casino only takes your money, this new cartel extracts something far more valuable. They harvest the computational power of your brain. You may believe you are consuming content. In the brutal economics of the digital era, however, you are the product being consumed. Your attention is the raw material, your emotional reaction is the refined oil, and your behavioral predictability is the final product sold to the highest bidder. The human brain is now the ultimate conquered territory, a biological colony ruled by an entity that holds zero physical ground. If the population realizes they are completely subjugated, they will inevitably rebel. To prevent this, the Leviathan must maintain the ultimate geopolitical illusion, the electoral theater. We are permitted to violently argue over which politician should hold office, encouraged to protest, and told that democracy is the sovereign power of the people. That is a mathematical lie. When a cartel possesses 5,000 behavioral data points on every single voter in a nation, elections cease to be a contest of political ideas. They become algorithmic stress tests with completely predictable, engineered outcomes. The cartel quietly funds both factions. They algorithmically feed the extreme right with their deepest fears and the extreme left with their deepest resentments, ensuring neither side ever achieves absolute victory. This dynamic maintains a perpetual, mathematically balanced stalemate. A deeply polarized, fragmented society is geopolitically impotent. While citizens are busy destroying each other over manufactured culture wars in the digital coliseum, the cartel rewrites the international banking laws. You cannot outvote a supercomputer, nor can you protest against a decentralized data structure. The state has been completely hollowed out, its authority consumed by the Leviathan of the algorithm. How do you fight a war when the battlefield is your own perception of reality? In traditional warfare, if you are outgunned, you retreat and fortify. Since you cannot physically retreat from an invisible digital network, the final frontier of geopolitical resistance is absolute ruthless cognitive discipline, the architecture of the sovereign mind. True rebellion in the 21st century is not shouting on the internet. Shouting generates data and feeds the machine. True rebellion is digital asceticism, the conscious, calculated establishment of a no-fly zone inside your own neurology. When the algorithm attempts to inject outrage into your feed to harvest your dopamine, you must observe the mechanism clinically and refuse to react. Emotional stoicism is no longer just a philosophy. It is the highest form of asymmetric warfare. By refusing to engage with the outrage machine, you commit the ultimate geopolitical crime against the cartel, data tax evasion. You starve their predictive models, render your behavioral profile mathematically useless, and become a statistical ghost. The East India Company fell because the sepoys realized their souls were being compromised. The tech cartel will only fall when enough individuals realize their consciousness is being strip-mined for dividend payouts.
The ultimate power does not reside in the server farms. It resides in your absolute ability to say no, to unplug from the manufactured theater, to look past the algorithmic shadows on the cave wall and recognize the architects of the matrix. History does not deal in hope or the comforting lies of the political theater. It requires you to brutally autopsy the cold, unforgiving anatomy of power, navigating the geopolitical winter with your eyes wide open. The corporate Leviathan is the most perfect system of control ever engineered. It owns the currency, the infrastructure, and the narrative. Yet it only owns your mind if you explicitly grant it permission. What happens then when the cartel's ultimate control mechanism inevitably fractures? What happens when the massive global debt bubble, inflating since the days of the Medici and the East India Company, finally reaches critical mass? The mathematical certainty is that the system will collapse. When the music stops, the Leviathan will not simply surrender its wealth. It will initiate the final protocol. It will attempt to confiscate everything. The legal framework is already written, and the trap is completely set. The blueprint for the coming financial reset is not a mere theory. It is the final desperate stage of the corporate cartel's life cycle. The masses will never see the trap closing until the locks click shut, which is why you must understand the exact mechanism designed to legally seize your remaining assets when the Leviathan starves. The final chapter of the financial endgame begins now.